Good morning, Minister. I want to raise the issue of reforming the existing Taxsaver commuter ticket to include shared mobility services and to recognise new work patterns like working from home, as has been proposed by several service providers. Minister, as you know, shared mobility is shared bikes, e-bikes, e-car share services that people can rent when they need them, and it complements rather than replaces existing public transport by providing flexible transport options that connects people to destinations that fixed public transport routes simply can't reach. The first mile and the last mile of any journey are as important as the middle, and we know there are people who would like to get to public transport to work, but at times that it takes them to get from their house to the bus stop or the station, or at either end of the commute, that can act as a disincentive. And for many commuters, shared mobility provides that vital last-mile connection between the bus stop and the train station and their home or work. And for others, it actually offers a full-on sustainable alternative to owning a private car for journeys that would otherwise have to be made by car. And I think the potential is really significant. Commercial bike-sharing services last year delivered more than 600,000 journeys, while car-sharing services facilitated over 500,000 journeys last year. And these numbers are expected to grow substantially, with estimates suggesting that expanding car-sharing alone could actually take demand for 300,000 private cars off our roads completely. The National Policy Statement on Shared Mobility was published last year, and it highlights OECD findings that shared mobility has enormous potential to reduce carbon emissions and support more sustainable travel, and I think that's an ambition we all support. However, the potential will only be realised if the sector receives the policy support that it needs. There are businesses operating on low margins, high cost models. We've already seen providers like Tier Dot withdraw bike sharing services from Irish towns and cities, including Limerick and Navan, while DriveU exited the Dublin car share market. And if we fail to act, we risk further market failure and losing services that are actually essential to a more sustainable transport network. And last year, the National Policy Statement on Shared Mobility Policy referenced the potential of introducing shared mobility voucher. I understand the sector has recently been told that that option of a voucher is now off the table. And if this is the case, there is another practical and achievable solution, and that is modernising the existing Taxsaver scheme. Quite simply, the existing Taxsaver model is no longer meeting the needs of today's commuters. Participation has fallen dramatically. In 2019, there was about 60,000 users, and that's fallen to 25,000 today. While initiatives like the 90-minute fare in Dublin have undoubtedly played a role, they don't fully explain this decline. And the reality is that the Taxsaver model is built around an outdated model of commuting. It works best for people with fixed travel patterns and convenient access to traditional public transport. But we know nowadays many workers split time between working from home and the workplace, and they rely on a combination of transport options to complete their journey. Yet the Travel Saver scheme completely excludes shared bikes, car share services, other sustainable transport models, and it is not providing the incentive for a genuinely multimodal travel model, and it also remains very much focused on Dublin transport patterns. So, Minister, if we're serious about encouraging sustainable travel, then Taxsaver must evolve. It needs to become more flexible, more inclusive and more reflective of how people travel today, and as a first step, I'm asking that the Minister for Finance would direct officials in his department to undertake a review of the Taxsaver scheme.
The proposal is to reform the Taxsaver commuter ticket scheme to include private shared mobility services. As somebody who's from the country and we suppose totally rely on bus services, it sounds like a very novel thing where you can have the shared mobility of bikes and cars and all the rest, way beyond what we experience in more rural parts, but wonderful to hear from yourself this morning. The key objective is to ensure and encourage behavioural change in favour of its usage of shared mobility services in Ireland, and would support integrated transport services like bike and scooter and car sharing through a virtual Taxsaver account model. The core objective is to encourage a shift in usage towards shared modes of transport in place of less efficient, congestion-inducing and carbon-intensive private car use, particularly for frequently undertaken journeys such as commuting. But I do take your point too that the existing architecture of the scheme is for, I suppose, reliable, constant and I suppose regular transport rather than the ones that most people have to do, which is a bit more flexible, particularly with working from home now. As the Deputy is aware, commuting employees currently have access to reliefs from benefit in kind in respect of sustainable transport, namely the Cycle to Work scheme under Section 118(5)G Tax Consolidation Act 1999 and the Taxsaver scheme under Section 1185A of the same Act. The schemes have similar objectives: to reduce car dependency and to encourage use of public transport and cycling as more sustainable forms of commuting. What is being proposed is really the introduction of a whole new scheme that would allow employees to choose to assign part of their salary to pay for shared mobility services. Specifically, the sacrifice pay could be transferred to a virtual card account operated by an approved third-party commercial provider. Under this proposal, the sacrifice pay would not be subject to PAYE or to USC or PRSI, while employers would benefit from reductions in employer PRSI. The actual operation of the ticketing wallet would be appropriate to the Department of Transport. However, there may be limitations to the terms of what the current ticketing scheme, primarily LEAP, can support. Subject to meeting the conditions of the scheme, there is currently no impediment to employers who wish to provide a voucher in respect of a shared mobility services to an employee under the small benefit exemption. The current threshold for this scheme is £1,500 per annum per employee. It is for each employer to decide whether to utilise this provision. The existing schemes are implemented as tax-exempt benefit in kind in order to keep the implementation as simple as possible and to reduce administrative burden for employers and employees. The schemes are designed to be as straightforward as possible to encourage uptake by employers. The proposed model is more complex than the existing scheme and is something that would require engagement with stakeholders, including employers, software providers and transport operators. It is important to note that the employers are not required to take part in the Taxsaver or Bike to Work scheme. Where an individual's employer does not participate in these schemes, any benefits that could arise under the relevant scheme will not be available to any employees of that employer. This means that an individual cannot avail of the scheme if their employee chooses not to participate. However, it should be noted that if an employer does not choose to participate in the scheme, employers' PRSI is not payable at the cost of the relevant benefits when they make the associated deductions from the employee's salary payments. Thus, this is an incentive for employers to participate in these schemes.
Minister, I think we can all agree that commuting patterns have changed a lot since the COVID pandemic, and that idea of the rigid 5-day, 10-journey commute along the same route every day has disappeared for many workers. And the Taxsaver scheme needs to change to reflect that new reality. And I think commuters want something that's more flexible, both to reflect the fact that they are commuting in less regular patterns, but also to reflect the increased desire for multimodal journeys. And Minister, the idea that a flexible Taxsaver ticket that includes shared mobility is one that I think is really worth exploring for these reasons. So in the context of the forthcoming budget, I would ask that the Department of Finance would seriously look at reviewing the scheme and design a pilot programme to see how this type of flexible ticket might work in practice. Could be achieved, and you've discussed it earlier, Minister, through a digital wallet that allows commuters to assign a certain portion of their gross pre-tax income each month, which they then could use to purchase passes for different transport services on flexible basis, depending on what modalities they needed and what particular days they needed for. And look, yes, this would require some additional digital infrastructure. It would require planning. But I think it would achieve a lot of flexibility that the current system doesn't actually achieve. And as such, that's why I'm proposing a pilot programme. I'm not suggesting we'd roll this out immediately, but a pilot programme is the perfect way to explore how this might function, test the system before we undertake a full rollout. And Minister, I would ask that you bring this to the Department of Finance and your government colleagues, because I think we are losing people from the Taxsaver scheme at a dramatic rate, and we have to do something dramatic to halt that.
Yeah, Deputy, I really do appreciate the sentiment of your presentation, and I don't disagree with any of it, and particularly when we do look at digitalisation, the travel wallet, all of that should be considered, and I will re-emphasise to both the Minister for Finance and Transport to perhaps look at this as a pilot programme. In considering proposals in respect of all tax expenditures, the Government must be mindful of the public finances and the many demands on the Exchequer. Tax reliefs, no matter how worthwhile in themselves, lead to a narrowing of the tax base, and a strong, convincing case for the benefits and outcomes needs to be articulated in due consideration to be given for the commitment of scarce taxpayer resources for such release. And to be fair, I think you've made that argument very strongly here today too. While the conditionality around the BIK exemption for the Taxsaver scheme falls under the Taoiseach's remit as Minister for Finance, the scope and conditions of travel passes on offer are a matter for the individual transport providers. As with all tax policy measures, the Taxsaver scheme is kept under review by the Department's finance officials. It is particularly important in considering proposals in respect of the tax expenditures that the Government is mindful of the public finances and the many demands on the Exchequer that the expansion of any scheme creates a cost, and that cost must be recovered elsewhere. At present, there are no specific plans to amend the tax legislation in respect of the Taxsaver scheme, which is considered to be operating well. In the programme for Government 2025, Securing Ireland's Future, contains a commitment to, within the lifetime of this Government, conduct a review of the Bike to Work scheme to boost take-up among all workers. The Minister's Department have engaged with officials in the Department of Transport in recent months in relation to this review and in terms of reference under any consideration. So again, I want to thank you and say that I will pass on your heartfelt sentiment to both ministers in relation to a pilot programme to consider this. Thank you.